Hello, everyone. Improper answer. Hello, everyone. All right, how you doing? This is our last panel of the day. Thank you for joining us on such a beautiful, awesome day indoors in the freezing air conditioning. What is with the air conditioning in this town? The fuck? Too cold. Thank you very much. This is going to be an interesting and I think really great, lively panel. We are here to talk about how data can actually save the media ecosystem and make the world better. I want to thank Amagi, our sponsor, one of the sponsors of our day, and I want to particularly thank VideoAmp, who is revolutionizing the way we measure video across the planet, for sponsoring this panel. I don't say this lightly. These people are my friends. They are my partners. They are really doing important work in the media ecosystem, and there's no way we could have made this day possible without them. So thank you, VideoAmp. Please take a look at them online if you can. I'm going to now go around and introduce our panelists. From my left, Josh Hudgens from VideoAmp, Chief Product Officer from VideoAmp. Next to him is Travis Scholes, who's the head of Advanced Marketing, SVP, Advanced Marketing at Paramount. And then to his left is Miranda Marcus, who is an Amy Webb one to watch, and is also the co-lead of BBC News Labs. Round of applause, please. All right, so I'm going to start with you, Josh. First of all, tell me I tried to explain what VideoAmp is, but what is VideoAmp?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, VideoAmp is a company that is changing how video is measured across the ecosystem, and we're doing this with a combination of like a more big data intensive approach, and also a more privacy conscious approach. So rather than relying on things like panels or historical techniques, we're using a lot more data, and we're doing a lot more to connect across all of these different silos and walled gardens that have started to emerge in the media landscape to give far more accurate and representative measurement of cross-platform video consumption.
So these panels are traditionally in the tens of thousands,
right?
Maybe 100,000 at max. But what's the size of the data pool that you're traditionally using?
Well, we'll have linear viewership data on tens of millions of devices, and then we work across the ecosystem with our publisher partners like Travis to more accurately measure digital exposure.
You two know each other?
Surprise!
How did that happen? I feel ambushed. So that's great. Travis, what is advanced marketing?
Yeah, so actually I lead advanced advertising. It's kind of the same thing. So look, largely what it is I work in the ad sales division for Paramount. So you guys know what our product is. We are football on Sundays on CBS, right? We are a long marathon of your favorite Star Trek shows on Pluto Television. We are MTV, we are Comedy Central, all of these things. And it is my job to sell advertising in those programs to generate money, to produce more of that content. And I'm I'm the data guy, quote unquote, which means that I leverage data to make better use and better monetize our advertising to keep that cycle going.
Okay, that feels clear. Thank you. Miranda, I know what BBC is, but what is BBC News Labs?
So BBC News Labs is an internal incubator, basically. So we are a team that's located in the newsroom. We have journalists, we have software engineers, we have designers, we have some machine learning experts. And our job is to invent the future of news, essentially. That's quite big, though. So what that means in practice is identifying opportunities to use new technologies to make new types of stories, but also to develop new ways of working with audiences and really understand how we can equip BBC News to continue to give value to all our audiences. And that's both UK audiences, but also our global audiences, because we have our British news, our English news, but we also broadcast in 42 languages. Around the world in regions where there is low media freedom. So yeah, there's a pretty big set of different audiences that we're trying to work with, and so really understanding how we can be telling stories in ways that can resonate with them.
So your team isn't journalists per se, they're product people and data people who work with the journalists to kind of craft this new evolution of news?
Oh, no, we have journalists in the team as well. So it's
Oh.
an interdisciplinary team. I co-lead the team with a wonderful person called Manjiri Carey. She's the editorial lead. I'm coming at this from a product and an innovation perspective, so understanding how we set up teams to do really good quality, evidence-driven innovation, essentially, in interdisciplinary innovation.
And how do, I mean, just quickly, if you can, I know this is a very kind of broad and open question. How do you use data to inform what your team does on an ongoing basis?
That is a very broad question. So, I mean, there's all sorts of data around trends, what's going on in technology. We obviously have an enormous amount of audience data. There's a huge amount of fantastic data that we draw on from research organizations like the Reuters Institute, for example, to really understand complex issues like trust. I think everybody in the world is talking about that right now, so we don't need to go into that too much.
We just had a panel all about trust.
Fantastic panel about that. Really enjoyed that. Our audience data, it really relies on people opting in. So that actually only gives us a small segment. Those are the people who are engaging with us. So one of the things that we're really interested in is understanding the audiences who aren't engaging with us and how we engage with them, how we understand what their needs are. And that's actually something that we don't have data for. So
Yeah, how do you know what you don't know?
yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's lots of different types of data that we use to inform it. And then, you know, a lot of it is about understanding what we can do that's actually going to make a difference and be different.
Fascinating. Travis, kind of the same question, but not. I mean, how has data changed? You've been at Paramount for how long?
A little over 4 years.
Okay, where were you before?
I worked for a consulting company building data-driven advertising products.
Oh, interesting. So, question is, how do you think data has changed advertising? You know, not how do you use it today, which is also kind of part of the question, but like, what makes advertising different in the context of the kind of sea of data that we're now in?
So the number one question, and actually, funny enough, we're at the time of the year people call upfronts, especially in the traditional television space, which is where the majority of advertising in the US is sold, is largely between now and May every year. 70, 80+%. So it's a very busy time. And right now, when we think about how we're trying to monetize advertising, how we're trying to generate our business, a lot of that is around, we have a very finite supply, especially in linear television. Fewer people are watching TV this year than we'll have last year, and that trend is expected to continue. Opposite on streaming. And it's our job to figure out how do we best utilize all of that content consumption in order to best monetize that. Data helps a lot to do that, right? Every ad that we send to somebody that is totally out of the market for that product is a wasted ad that we could have sent to somebody else, that somebody else would have found more valuable. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is we need to continue to attract folks to watch content, right? There's a little bit of a flywheel here. The more people we can get to tune in and to watch Paramount content on any of our platforms, frankly, the more that inventory we have to sell. And this is kind of like the fundamental notion of our business. So from that perspective, leveraging data allows us to do things like minimize the number of times you see the exact same ad, when you watch some of our channels, or minimize the times
over frequency, which is a real issue. It's a real user experience problem.
Yeah, and especially as viewership fragments, right? I think the stat right now, and you probably know better than I am, I'm sure you've got a pie chart, but there's like what, four and a half typically streaming subscriptions per household in America right now, somewhere around in that neighborhood. By the way, there's still 60, 70 million install base of paid television households. Your total household viewership in America is about 110 million households when you include broadcast television. It's a lot of content. And our job is to make sure that people aren't watching football on Sundays and then flipping on Pluto TV and also getting clobbered by the same amount of ads. And the more and more people start to fragment across these platforms, the more important that becomes. So really, those are kind of the two ways that we generally think about leveraging data. How can we make the advertising experience, I'm going to use the word efficient. It's a bad word here. People think about efficiency and price, but efficient from if you give us $1, how many incremental products do you expect to sell as a General Motors or as a P&G? And then improving the user experience so that we have a larger audience to sell advertising against.
Travis brings up a really good point, Josh, which is this overfrequency, this kind of collision of impressions generated this clutter. I talked earlier today about the fact that how the average consumer now has 100 different logons. How does, I mean, you in particular, your team is focused on removing the overreach or the over frequency of ads against consumers, to improving the efficiency, so reducing the amount of waste that ads put out there. But also, I think to a certain extent, the byproduct of that, whether this is your intention or not, is to improve the user experience, is to make it much more enjoyable, so that, I mean, people don't actually hate ads, they hate bad ads, and they also hate inappropriate ads at the wrong time. How does your product address something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Generally, there's a relationship between the effectiveness of advertising in general and how good the user experience for that advertising is. To use Travis's words, the least efficient, the less efficient advertising is the worse the user experience. You have things like overfrequency, you have ads that have nothing to do with you, you're seeing the same ad over and over everywhere you go. So the better advertising works, the better the user experience will be. The way we address that is the controls Travis is talking about doing. They can manage with quite a bit of precision within the broader Paramount universe, but to the point, right? I subscribe to a half dozen services, and I can watch, because I have certain demographic characteristics. As I watch in one service or another, I will just get clobbered with the same number of advertisers across services with massive, unpleasant overfrequency, or ads that have nothing to do with me, or sometimes no ads at all,
Right.
and just like a really disjointed experience. So one of the things we do at VideoAmp is we can help share data across these different silos of information, right? We can make the interoperability work in a way that also respects the sanctity and privacy constraints of the data, so that the user experience makes sense, that it's coherent across all of these different silos of content. So as I go from one platform to another, the advertiser now can control things like they can monitor frequency across different content silos, across different streaming platforms, across their linear buys. They can understand more accurately the consumption of advertising experience for their ads. And that's what advertisers want. And one of the things they've been frustrated with as we've gone from, granted, an absolutely unsustainable Wild West of data exchange,
Right.
to this more circumspect and guarded world of data silos, is they've lost the ability to control the user experience of advertising, often to the detriment of their brands. And that's the thing they care very much about. So they want to be able to control frequency and user experience and relevancy across all of the places that they buy ads. And what we do is we make that possible by giving them a deduplicated, unified view of how users are consuming their advertising across all of the places they buy.
And the way you do that, as I understand it, but I am not a data scientist nor a technician, I'm a college dropout. So tell how my mom defines me. I'll talk about that later, over drinks. But the question, as I understand it, you have a pretty sizable pool of data, some of which you've leased, some of which you've generated.
Sure.
Then you combine that with the platform's data, first-party data, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you combine that with the partner, the advertiser's first-party data. You anonymize it, you privatize it, very important.
Yep.
And then you're able to kind of create predictive outcomes from that. Is that a fair assessment of how that works?
That's a great description of it. So basically, we have data that's more or less our data. We have data that we license. We have data that we partner with others to do joint analysis on. But the challenge with all of that is all that data is moving around in a very complex privacy and regulatory landscape that we have to be incredibly conscientious about. So we've developed a series of technologies that make doing joint analysis across these various data sets possible in a way where the data never actually gets shared across parties. So you can do things like
The
what
specific
you described.
data, but it is commingled to create these predictive outcomes.
That's the magic of the clean room environment is we can join things like linear data with digital data with outcome data, like did you buy a product or not, all without anybody being able to see anybody else's data, and produce aggregate analysis, like how people consumed ads across both linear television and digital streaming properties, and whether or not it drove outcomes, like did I buy more P&G products, which is ultimately what advertisers want to know, and helps power that more positive user experience. Because the more valuable advertising is, the better ultimately it is for users.
And so I want to turn to you, Miranda, for a second, because there's this idea that by commingling data and sharing resources in a privacy-compliant way, right, we can create better outcomes, not just for the advertisers, but also for the consumers themselves.
Yes.
More personalization, less overfrequency, less clutter. I'm not seeing diaper ads because I haven't had kids in 25 years. Those types of things. Isn't the goal, or isn't the destination that we should be heading towards an area where all the major platforms, all the major providers, all the major publishers are creating a single cache of data where we can kind of create that analysis on an ongoing basis? And isn't that kind of corporate collaboration some kind of goal that we should have for ourselves? I ask that, and then I point to you because you are a part of the CTPA, which is the Coalition for Content, Provenance, and Authority, which sounds very British. And their main goal is for trust in news, right? So it's not really an advertising product. It's not really it's not a product to create a better atmosphere for the kind of larger corporate largesse, but more for a way to predict what's the word I'm looking for? Credibility and authenticity of the news source. If you know where it's made or who made it, you can have trust in it. Is that a good description of what the goal of the CTPA is? C2PA?
It's pretty good, yeah.
Thanks.
I can add to it, though.
Yeah, please do.
And unfortunately, I'm so sorry. It's actually an American, and there was Adobe, Microsoft, and the BBC, along with the New York Times, were actually founding partners, along with some other people. So we can't take credit for that very British name. So the C2PA is really is an open standard, and it's about media provenance. So it's really looking to address how do we create cross-industry mechanisms and infrastructures to allow internet users to understand whether or not, and have the agency to decide whether or not what they're seeing online is authentic or not, and what the context of that media is, so that they can understand if it's relevant or not within the context that they're being served it, right? So we obviously think about this a lot in terms of mis and disinformation. We also think about this in terms of our brand integrity, because there's an enormous amount of falsified media that looks like BBC content but isn't. So the idea essentially is using not new, shiny new technologies. It's about using actually a very mature technical approach of cryptographic encoding, where all the way through the media production and distribution chain, every time something happens to that piece of media, image or video, possibly sound as well we're looking at, that gets encoded into the image. So you have it's almost like an audit trail, a history of the image, so that you can go and interrogate it, and an individual can see who took the picture, where they took the picture, where it was edited, where it was published, etc. The idea there being that once that reaches a network scale, once it has that systems impact, particularly when the platforms lean in as well, the third-party platforms, you have an ability to say this is authentic and this is not authentic, right? But you also have an ability for organizations like OpenAI, who've just signed up to C2PA, to say we're flagging our content as synthetic. So you've got that infrastructure providing data to audience members to empower them.
So ultimately, if I click on a picture, I'm going to be able to go look at its provenance.
Yeah.
And obviously the benefit for that is you can tell a deep fake from a non-deep fake instantaneous as a consumer, right? There's a deed as such on the back end of the property.
Yeah, absolutely. Deep fakes are definitely a use case, and it's I think the use case that gets people excited and is the one that kind of the allows people to really understand the power of this. But it's also incredibly important for images. We've just on last Monday, BBC News published our first C2PA signed media, and it was for TikTok footage of violence happening in Haiti. And that was on the ground eyewitness testimony of actual newsworthy events, but not from Getty or Reuters or AP. So we needed to do all of the due diligence that our newsroom does as standard we had to check the weather on the time that it said. We geolocated it using Street View. We checked the angles on the shadows, all of that due diligence, which our journalists do every day in order to make sure that we're not spreading mis and disinformation. That's now encoded into the media.
So this was a basically smartphone shot piece of video
Yeah.
on the street in Haiti
Yeah,
that you were able to prove was actually happening,
yeah.
and then you gave it that stamp, which enabled to show the provenance.
And not just that. So we could show that data, but it's encoded into the media. So when
So
that
wherever
gets
it goes.
wherever it goes, that's encoded in, right? So deepfakes are really important. They're a really important part of this, but it's also really important to be showing when things are
For real-
authentic
for
and
authentic,
the
yeah.
context of them. I think that was a really important thing that came out in the previous panel. Context is king. Relevance is so important because you've got deepfakes, you've got cheapfakes. Cheapfakes don't need synthetic
Well, that's
media,
Kate
right?
Middleton, then. Sorry, couldn't resist.
Below the belt, mate. No comment.
No comment? So that's a really good demonstration. I don't know her. Really good demonstration of how I think a bunch of for-profit public service media gathered together to create this kind of real, as you said, system-wide way of proving the authenticity of content or proving the disauthenticity of content.
And it's in everyone's interest. This
Right,
is the thing.
absolutely.
There will be, I'm sure, commercial benefits for it. There will be ways that corporate organizations, private sector organizations will be able to add to their brand and create better relationships with their audiences and their consumers. But fundamentally, the CTPA has been set up for public good. And, it is cross-industry as well. It's not just public-private. It's, you've got Canon, who are hardware makers, all the way through to
Do you have any
Google.
American publishers involved?
New York Times are involved. Yeah,
I guess
there's a whole-
OpenAI is
it's
an American
OpenAI.
publisher.
It's absolutely global. We've got thousands and thousands of organizations signing up and looking at how they're going to be rolling this into their systems. It is really building momentum.
So speaking of kind of cross-corporate collaboration on what I call a JIC, Joint Industry Council, Joint Industry Committee, you're the chair. I didn't know this until today.
Yeah.
The chair of the American Advertising JIC. That's just what it's called, right?
Yeah.
What's the aim of that organization? And B, there's something happening right now around that's kind of important. Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, sure. So one thing that's important to note, I don't know how familiar everybody is with the mechanics of ad sales, so I'll assume not very.
Assume not.
So one of the interesting things about the American ad sales market is it, especially in traditional television, operates kind of like a futures market, right? So not only do you have to figure out how much you want to charge for a commercial, you typically sell that on the number of people that watch it. So the person that's counting and how well they're counting the number of people that watch it becomes very, very important, right? And for the last forever, that's really just been done by one company, the Nielsen company. In the last couple of years, because of how fragmented media has become in the American landscape with the sort of increase in streaming, and by the way, the change in how people consume media during COVID from traditional television box to streaming to OTA, staggering. The world changed incredibly rapidly in a few years. I think we all know that, but that didn't.
It accelerated the changes that were already kind of rolling into place. We bought more smart TVs than we did before. We signed up for more streaming services than we ever did before. It really just took what was going to happen and accelerated it by probably a decade, I think.
And one of the interesting things that happened then was a whole bunch of other companies just basically jumped into the space to say, well, in this new environment, it's a lot harder to measure who's watching and what they're watching. And we have different and better data sets than you've traditionally been relying upon for the last 50, 70 years, so you should use us instead of your traditional methods in order to transact on advertising against. A company like VideoAmp, companies like iSpot, ComScore, et cetera. The US Joint Industry Committee basically popped up because it became for a minute in advertising like the wild, wild west. People were guaranteeing on viewership data that was being counted by 3 or 4 different companies with different methodologies and different data sources and different ways to think about this. So what the US JIC, which is the single worst acronym said out loud, but I understand that, but we're just going to go with it. When the JIC came together, their goal and what they're actually working on this week is They run a process where annually companies like VideoAmp can apply. They are analyzed by a collection of traditional media publishers like Paramount. And
Across like 12 different criteria, right?
yeah, a lot. Actually, so the fun, when, you know how these scope tends to creep over time? I don't know if you guys ever noticed this. But I was actually reviewing the JIC report over the weekend. I think there's like well over 700 different individual tests now that are being run against all these data sources. And it's data scientists contributed from Paramount, from NBC Universal, Warner Brothers Discovery. It's also buyers, your Group M's, Omnicom.
So there are like subcommittees for each little.
Yeah, I mean, it's media. Subcommittees, committees, three-letter acronyms. This is essentially what we've built the entire industry on. And what they're doing is they're essentially trying to come together and have an honest discussion and look at the data and say, do we think that it's commercially reasonable to transact media against these data sets? We've never really done it before. We've done it sort of, you know, in these small areas. But to state the shift, the impact on media advertising from moving to a multiple data set marketplace where you can now transact advertisement against video from VideoAmp or Nielsen or iSpot or ComScore, the impact to the advertising industry is massive, right? And one of the things it really does and really enables, talking about how we can use data to make media better, is all of these sources are, like Josh mentioned, very, very large data sets. And they allow us to understand with a better degree of granularity, like, what do people like, right? What are they watching? How do we best advertise to them? So then it becomes this big circle. And that's kind of really what the US JIC is about, is saying, hey, we need to move forward. We need a lot of innovation in this space. We need to go fast. So let's have a body that can basically stand up and say, is this data good enough to transact? I mean, what, the US TV industry and advertising is like 70 billion a year or so right
75,
now.
yeah.
And then digital, obviously, on top of that, which is all your CTV, is even bigger. So you're talking about real money.
And so you're voting now on this. One of the chief criteria is interoperability, yes?
Absolutely.
How do you, I'll ask both of you this, and actually also I think equally important to you, how do you make sure that, and I'll start with you, Travis, how do you make sure that it isn't truly interoperable, that the phone, the CTV, the iPad, the Apple Watch, the free streamer, the paid streamer, the podcast, they all can actually kind of track the data without losing the trail?
So let's talk a little bit about how data tracking works, especially in television. And I am the guy that sends you data-targeted advertising. So I will tell you in general, right, like, one of the interesting things, and I think to the point around how does this all work and what have we all done to share data with each other, Josh mentioned that we've invested tremendous amounts of money in these new exotic data infrastructures to avoid sending each other any information. And there's a good reason for that, right? It's difficult, and we have to be good stewards of this user data. But what does that practically mean? So if you're going to actually execute a data-driven campaign, right? Somebody on my group wants to put ads in for Stellantis on Yellowstone. Stellantis makes Ram trucks. I was recently heard in a meeting that they're almost like another character on Yellowstone at this point. They've been a huge partner for us. But obviously, right, with that brand, we want to kind of build on that. So how do we know if you are in the market for a truck? Well, I don't know, there's probably auto registration data somewhere or some data that's available that people can license or lease, or maybe you signed up on ram.com for information and they'll send us that information and they want us to really kind of come after you with advertising. What do we see? Well, we see essentially a bunch of random characters we all use the word hashed. What that means is that it's ABC 1, 2, 3, DEF, just a bunch of nonsense. And we see that flow through essentially a tech stack with no real desire or means to sort of work that back into who you are as a person. All we care about is the fact that, like, you showed up and
are you shopping for a truck?
That you were buying for a truck, and I saw you pop up because your IP address that was in that truck area hit my ad server, and now you are going to get a truck advertisement. And ideally, we can take it one step further and see, did you actually go buy a truck, right? And that tells us how well did our advertising work. And obviously, from my perspective, the better I can show that it works, the more I can charge for it. And what that means is the more episodes of Yellowstone we can ultimately put on air.
Josh, the butts and trucks to me is now kind of the higher measurement than eyeballs on screen. Like, yeah, it's great that I generated 10,000 eyeballs on that episode of Yellowstone, or 10 million in case of Yellowstone. But really all I care is how many of them bought a truck at the end of the day, right? Isn't that ultimately the destination that we're moving towards, as opposed to impressions generated, it's outcomes generated?
Yeah, so if you imagine the way TV was when I was a kid, many
100 years ago.
1,000 years ago. There were a handful of channels. They were all measured the same way, and you transacted in gross rating points that Nielsen calculated off a panel. And that was the apples to apples comparison people used to understand how one thing performed relative to another in the advertising world. Not only is the landscape fragmented, but the formats and ways we experience content have fragmented even more. It's not like we're just watching TV but on more channels. We're watching TV, but we're also like looking at TikTok videos and scrolling through social feeds and going on YouTube and encountering random ads and videos and content all over the place in different ways. It's really hard, if you're an advertiser, to come up with a metric that's impression-based that lets you do apples-to-apples comparisons across all of that stuff, right?
So especially because some people are watching on phones, some people are watching on watches, some people are watching on TV.
So how do you allocate your dollars? That's really the question. You can't allocate them just based on gross rating points anymore. So you got to come up with a metric that works just as well for advertising on a social feed as it does for advertising on premium video. And if you're an advertiser, what you ultimately care about is how many dollars of sales did I generate for a dollar of advertising? You want some kind of really normalized return on ad spend metric, and that's really going to come down to outcome measurement. And so the better we get at being able to measure exposures across all of these different silos and then linking them back to real world outcomes, the more effective and efficient advertising will become. Because ultimately, that's going to be the metric that normalizes across all these formats. We could argue about impression qualifiers and what the definition of premium is and what the definition of social is and whether an ad was viewable or not, all of that stuff. But ultimately, it's going to be outcomes that tell the tale on how effective ad spend really is.
Yeah, I mean, because at least half of the media economy is driven by advertising. Some is driven by subscription. Some is driven by support from the public. Or governmental sources, but ultimately, in order to keep the content going globally, we need a vibrant ad economy. And if we can't measure, if we don't know what to measure and we can't measure it, it doesn't really matter how good the quality of the content is.
And the really cool thing is the data and the infrastructure to actually bring that world into being is like we now can see that world coming where there's enough sophistication, there's enough data, there's enough privacy infrastructure to do it in a way that respects the user's data and its provenance, that we can actually get to a world with near universal outcome measurement. It's pretty exciting.
Great.
Yeah.
I want to turn to you, Miranda, for a second. But before I do, there's a microphone halfway through the room here. Rather than waiting till the end, because that's what traditional people do, if you have a question, go over to the mic, and if I see you standing there, I will call on you. So feel free. Same question to a certain extent, which is, with this Tower of Babel of devices out there in the world, and platforms, and you said your news travels all over the world in 47 languages. How do you make sure that the data you're getting and providing stays pristine?
Stays
Pristine.
Pristine. I'm going to reframe it, if that's okay,
Please.
a little bit, because we work in a really, really different way. And as I said, like personalization and making sure that audiences are getting really relevant experiences is incredibly important. But a lot of that is about opt-in. It is about sign-in. That is a decision that the BBC has made.
What does that mean?
That means that you have to sign in to the BBC platform, and then we will have your data. Otherwise, we don't know who you are. Okay, so that is a very...
Do you tell the consumers that as they're signing in?
That's very, very clear, and that's very much part of the trusted relationship that the BBC wants to create with its audiences, right? So it's a lot about giving really, really meaningful new forms of value when an audience member has signed in and has given their data. And we have an enormous amount of content and many, many platforms. We've got Sounds, we've got iPlayer, we've got App, plus the Fact All the World service. And then we syndicate a load of content as well, but that's beside the point. So how do we give really, really rich and meaningful experiences across all those platforms once they've given us their data? That's a really great question. But also, how do we give really, really rich and meaningful experiences when that data hasn't been given is a much more nuanced and complex challenge, right? And in order to do that, we need to understand our own content more than we need to, we really need to understand our content so we can be giving absolutely world-leading experiences, right? And we can do fantastic recommendations where people can have control over those recommendation engines, but also have editorial oversight and compliance around them, so we're not just serving whatever is going to increase the eyeballs, but we're giving really high-quality experiences that give high-quality journalism that matters, right? And so transcription, translation, really leveraging all of these different technologies that are coming up so that we can understand our own content. We might have a fantastic interview, right, on the Today program, which would, a great story is a great story in any language. So we're really excited about ways that we can use data-driven systems and creating more data about our own content so that we can say, great interview on the Today program, let's make sure that that moves really rapidly across our newsroom and that our journalists can collaborate really, really effectively so that can go out on every outlet in a way which is really good quality journalism and relevant to all those different audiences.
So the relevancy part is fascinating for me because you don't necessarily think, I mean, you think of BBC News and BBC World Service as kind of just providing the news, right? And the news is the news. But, you know, as we all know, those who choose the news choose what is the news, meaning like there are things you do report, there are things you don't report. How do you measure relevancy?
Okay, another very big question. How do you measure relevancy?
Well, but you said we want to make sure that our news is relevant to the audience who's receiving it. And by the way, we want to, in the case of the ads, so we know it's relevant because we know this person's shopping for a truck.
Yeah.
The thing I hate most, those Warby Parker glasses, the thing I hate worse about advertising right now is I'll just buy a pair of Warby Parker glasses and then I'll see 12 more ads for Warby Parker glasses. So yeah, it's relevant, but it's not really relevant because I'm not going to buy another set of $500 glasses, right? So in your case, though, for the most part, in your main territory, the economic drivers of advertising aren't a relevant metric to go against. So whether or not they want to buy a pair of Warby Parker glasses or a can of Coke or a Ram truck, what's the name of the company that runs Ram?
Stellantis.
What's it called?
Stellantis.
It is not.
Stellantis.
Isn't it Chrysler?
It's definitely Stellantis.
When I was a kid, they were called Chrysler, but yeah, I forgot that they merged with 12 other companies. But how does relevancy work when there aren't those kind of same economic drivers? When the relevancy is, does this person need this piece of news? How can you tell whether this person, is it geography based, is it age based, is it income based? How do you figure out what's relevant for a consumer when it comes to something as important, precious, and kind of unique as news?
Yeah, so in terms of eyeballs and engagement is still, unfortunately, the best way that we have to do that, but it isn't perfect. Like to the discussion you were having a minute ago, actually, you might only have watched, outside of the news context, you might only have watched a little bit of Glastonbury. You might not have watched all 8 hours of that footage, but it might have been the most incredible concert that you've ever seen, and it really, really, really gave you value. It gave you that public service value, and the license fee was worth it because of that, right? Similarly, back in the news context, like, you might need to know where your polling station is, and you were able to find it more easily on the BBC than you were on your local authority website. So that is a really, really important thing that we're trying to understand, and I've got fantastic colleagues in R&D who are thinking about these kind of human value metrics and how we can understand what data proxies we can use at scale in order to measure that. And that's really complex, really nuanced, but very thoughtful work that's quite relevant to the BBC, but I know that there's many other public service organizations who are thinking about that too.
What did you call it? Human value
metrics. So like, has this increased my connection? Has this enabled me to participate in civic democratic society? Things like that.
Yeah, I want to get back to that in a second, but we do have a question. What's your name, sir?
Yeah. I'm Hernane.
Say it one more time.
Hernane.
Inati. Can you, what's your question?
My question is about how dependable are you guys from the device? For example, do you see a world where TV is not existing anymore and wearables and VR experience? Is that a thing for you, or no matter what the device, Paramount, for example, can sell and track everything. And does it change anything? Like the VR, if you go to...
Are you
So-
agnostic to platform? Or
So yeah, we a lot of the investment that we've been making has specifically been oriented to become more agnostic around this area. And the reason for that is because the sort of spectrum of ways that people are consuming our content, including on which devices, is continuing to grow pretty rapidly. We're, I'm going to say, fortunate enough, at least I am for my job, to not have to really think about things outside of an actual television too much, because that is still where the vast majority of our content
By the way,
consumption
it's the
happens.
vast majority, not the vast majority, the majority of television viewed in the United States is still on the TV, traditional pay TV or broadcast. 50% or more every month still to this day. Sorry.
But I mean, I look at Pluto TV. That's a great example of an area that's a little bit different for us, right? So Pluto TV is something called a FAST channel. FAST stands for free ad-supported streaming television. And what that means is you can go right now into pluto.tv, fire it up, and without having to log in to register, it'll just start playing television, right? That's another area where now we have to try to figure out how to best monetize the ads in that experience, where we have much less information than we would, because we're not having you sign with an email address or any of those things. And actually, it's funny, because I'll kind of go to this point you made earlier about I see all these Warby Parker ads. You know, we always sort of see the bad part around data targeting, I think, in advertising. I've got a better one than glasses, because my wife owns several pairs of Warby Parker, so maybe that's effective. But I bought a toilet seat on Amazon and have been getting just nothing but toilet seat ads. And it's like, how many of these things do you possibly think I need?
How many toilets do I have?
Right? But I would also argue that that's a result of too little data, or data that's too hard to use. Because the reason you're seeing so many ads for Warby Parker is we know just enough to know that you might want to buy one, but we don't know enough to know you've already seen it 1,000 times.
Or that I bought them.
Or that you bought them, right? But it's still probably better than Pampers diapers or something else, right? And that's kind of the modern state, because one of the things that we don't ever talk about is how this data is actually used and how it gets applied. And it's not it's still horseshoes and hand grenades, guys. Like, it's not laser focused. I'll give one more example to the personalization piece. Personalization is a great thing, right? If you think about streaming content, especially for VOD, video on demand, where you have to pick, right? We don't just show it to you. You want to have somebody recommend you a show that's good for what you've watched. Most of those algorithms, at least the ones that I'm aware of, that recommend to you, don't actually recommend it to you. They recommend it to a bunch of people that kind of look like you. And what's the reason for that? Well, it ends up in the United States, you're not allowed to connect people's viewership data, or what they're watching, right? Content consumption, the shows I watch, with any actual identity information about them because of VPPA.
Not even their logon?
Not even their logon.
Is that why, like, I'll get back on Netflix or Hulu and it doesn't show me the show I was just fucking watching last time I was there?
Well, that's, you know, there's a... but you, by the way,
that befuddles me.
by the way, you know why that law exists?
Why?
So that if you rented a porno video at Blockbuster back in the 90s,
Your mom wouldn't find out.
they couldn't back into figuring out who you were, right? And as a result, your Netflix algorithm it works a little bit worse. So I think that's one other piece.
So a rule made back when Blockbuster existed
yeah.
now continues to be the guiding principle, despite the fact that the company doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, I mean, you think that's the most ridiculous one?
Yeah.
Come on, right? Like, most of the laws that we operate that regulate and govern the way that streaming television work were written well before streaming television, and hell, a lot of them before the internet existed, right? And that's the landscape that we're navigating. And I think that people are scared of people harvesting their data and using it.
I don't think that they are. Quick question. Who has a banking app on their phone right now? Raise your hand. Who read the terms and conditions on the banking app before they installed it on their phone? 2 people. Who are lying, by the way. You're the bank. You work at a bank. All right. So raise your hands again. They're collecting all your data, and no, it doesn't seem like consumers give a shit.
But, well, also, there's real value to that for the consumer. So banking's a great example. If you read right now the T's and C's on your credit card, if you get credit card points, right? Like, hey, I got a Visa from Chase or whatever, I get 2% cash back, or I have Amex points or whatever. Read the T's and C's. In almost all cases, your transaction history that's creating those points is being tracked and is available for sale to people like me. And why is that? Because somebody's paying for those points, right? And the person that's paying for those points is Stellantis.
Who? Who? It's called a callback there, Travis. What's your name, sir?
I'm Haka, a product designer from Max. I have a question for Josh and Travis specifically. Recently, we are seeing the idea of interactive ad, especially with AVOD experiences. I think the best example of that was like the last holiday season, Walmart and Roku and Walmart and Hallmark, they did this with Roku and some of the other platforms, that the whole rom-com content was shoppable. It's a very cool idea. It sounds very engaging. The data shows like people are engaging with that, but the conversion is not that much high. So what do you think about this, the future of interactive ads? Do you think it's just like a failed experience, a failed feature, or still the tracking that data could be helpful?
No, in a past life, I was at YouTube for a long time and worked on some of the shoppable formats there. And there are people across the landscape that are having quite a bit of success with mixed mode advertising and direct conversion from the ad experience. It is a very challenging user experience problem. I don't think it's necessarily like to say that the experimentation with the format itself, largely speaking, is failing. We're seeing pockets of success here and there. It's mostly, can you get the user experience right? Because you have to be very specific about when people are actually shopping versus when they're consuming, and to make sure you introduce buying moments in the right context, because context is really, really critical to making those formats work. And if you don't get the mode and the context correctly, people will be turned off by the intrusion. But if you can get it right, it tends to be really, really effective.
I mean, beyond even getting it right or wrong, right, it's an extra ad opportunity that you can sell that doesn't infringe on the rest of the real estate, right? Like, realistically, ad load is a very carefully scrutinized metric in TV. If we run too many ads, you turn the channel. So a shoppable ad is a nice way to continue to increase value without increasing ad load, which allows us to draw more revenue from a fixed source. It also helps people, continue to have attention.
Right, it's not so much, I think people focus on the publishing side on shoppable ads as a way to generate revenue through bounties and things like that. To me, it's less about like taking 2 cents off of every purchase made, and it's more about increasing your ad inventory and making each ad that much more valuable, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. So I have a podcast that just hit top 10% most popular podcasts, and it's been a huge surprise for me. I want to be able to know more about my listeners and what they're interested in, but I'm not sure where to begin. Where would I collect data on people, and what should I be looking for, especially when I'm looking at creating stories people are interested in? What data should I?
How do you, you force people to go through your app to give you data, like the British government. But sorry, I'm an American, we're still bitter. But that is a good question. You do more audio probably than anybody on this stage. What would your advice be?
Well, there's obviously the actual consumption data, and you can also just talk to your audience. You could get involved with them. You can reach out to them, create a Discord community, understand what stories they want to be told and how they can participate in it. Okay, I would say that your content is probably going to also be improved by that. But there are plenty of ways to collect data about your audience. I'm not sure how you're distributing your media, so it's probably going to be connected to those broadcasting infrastructures. But yeah, happy to talk to you about it afterwards if that's helpful.
Yeah, my answer would be I distribute all my content on either LinkedIn or on Substack. Substack, not a perfect platform, but I know the email address of every reader, every single one, and we interact on a regular basis. And on top of that, you can put podcasts on there. So finding a way to take your most avid or most ardent listeners and get their email address so that you can have a direct conversation with them. Instead, I'm assuming your 2 biggest platforms are Apple and Spotify, who give almost no data to the publishers themselves. So to me, it is about a workaround, whether it's a Patreon account or a Substack or something that gives you that direct email access to your consumers. Ultimately, in my mind, the future of media is not built around mass anymore. It will be for Google and Meta and Amazon and YouTube and some of the others, Walmart, Vizio. But I think ultimately we've moved to an era where the depth of passion, your community, your cult is your currency. And if you have listeners who listen to every week, ask them to send you their email address. And that, to me, that direct one-to-one conversation is important, not just for publishers like yourself, but also for publishers like these, who need not to have to go through the third-party platforms to always speak to their most ardent fans.
I really strongly agree with that. Like if
I did not know how you were going to end that
I
sentence.
know. Mate, you have been rinsing me all day, so it's my turn. If what you want is to know what stories are going to be meaningful for your audience, like engage with your audience, like trying to understand them from afar probably isn't going to be as effective. That's the point. And I think we've been doing loads and loads of work at the BBC about creating communities around some of our leading audio brands, like Newsnight. And you might think that actually creating a Discord community where people are going to be talking about news content is a recipe for disaster, but actually creating a safe space where there's clear moderation that doesn't shut people's opinions down, but does say, please don't swear, that actually creates better discourse, and people are really leaning in and really connecting and having a really deep connection with the presenters and with the talent. And that's what we want, to really create those authentic relationships, not just with the BBC, but with the people who make the BBC.
How long did it take you to explain what Discord is to the senior management at BBC?
Oh, we just did it and then told them.
Because I was going to ask you, what was Deborah Turner's reaction when you said you were going to create a...
That's fine, we just need to sell it in sounds, don't worry about it.
Next question. All right, sorry, what's your name?
My name is Martin. I work as the head of product for the data and insight team at NRK, which is a Norwegian public broadcaster. So we have a lot in common with BBC, amongst others. But we also have sort of a very different model for operating than the Americans, because we are governmentally funded. We don't have any ads. We don't need money.
Wait, don't say you need money. You just get it from a different source.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, okay, let's put it that way. But that also makes that we have some challenges with sort of getting the organization up to speed with what data can actually provide, because we don't have that sort of money as the incentive for using data. And being a very traditional broadcaster, like we have linear TV, we have linear radio, as still some of the largest audience platforms that we reach our audience. How should we, as a traditional publisher and broadcaster, move from that linear period of time into a digital era where we have a lot of data, we've upgraded all of our tracking systems, so we have a lot more data, but we're still struggling with that last step to get the entire organization on board about why this new era is the actual way to go and not get stuck in history?
Unless you want to talk about public service broadcasting. You're welcome to, everyone. Yeah, it's a great question. And how exciting that you've got all that data and that you're making that transition. I think it's an issue that a lot of different companies beyond just media have been struggling with. I think it comes down to questions, like what is the question you're trying to answer, and demonstrating the level of impact. There's also a whole really interesting piece about valuing your data sets and being able to say this is worth investing in because this is how much value it gives back to the wider organization as well. But the question that you've asked is a really, really good one, but it's a very, very broad one, and there's so much data, it does so much. And to the point that these guys have been making, the more interoperable your data is and the more you can use it in more complex combinations, you can answer so many more questions. So it really comes down to what questions are you trying to answer and what are you trying to achieve with the organization as you move forward. What is the new impact you're trying to create for your audiences?
I think it's easy still that since even though we don't sell subscriptions, we still need people to be loyal towards public broadcaster.
Because as I said, you still need the government to fund you, and if you lose your relevancy, right? At some point, the next media bill, I don't know what your version is called, but in the UK it's called the media bill, the next time the government has to make a decision on whether to fund you or not, it's going to become more difficult. I think the best way to get everybody in your team, and I have thought a great deal about public service media and digitization and the role it has and its responsibility to be present on various digital platforms. I think show them the data. Show them the fact that I'm sure you do very well with children because you probably have a ton of kids programming, but then there's probably a huge gap between 15 and 30 where you're just not getting them, right? They're on TikTok, they're on YouTube, now the largest channel on the face of the earth. 50% of YouTube viewership is on connected television, pretty much everywhere. In your market, the #1 channel on television is YouTube. And I imagine that the consumers in your market between the ages of 15 and 30 do not give a shit about your public service broadcaster.
You're absolutely correct.
So show them, I mean, and I think this is one of the big failings of senior management at most of these companies is that they don't think that people age. No, there's 15, who cares? Well, someday they'll be 25, and then they'll be 35, and then they'll be 45. And they're not gonna suddenly grow a taste for coffee. It's just not how it works. And so I do think showing them the data, the risk of losing 3 generations of consumers to YouTube, to TikTok. And granted, here in the United States, we had a TikToker break a piece of news this week that all of the mainstream news media missed about the fallacy that somebody told on national television after the State of the Union address. It took a TikToker with Google, no big research team, to find that out. The more reliable younger generations think social video is versus public service media, the more at risk you are to lose that relevancy. And if you lose that relevancy, you will lose that funding. I can pretty much guarantee you.
Thank you.
Sure.
But how, so you can evidence that with the data, just to throw that back to you there. You can evidence that with the data.
I can
right?
evidence that with BBC's own
Oh,
data.
God, yeah, 100% you can evidence that with the data. With that message has landed. The question is, what do you do with it then, right? That's the bigger question. Like, it is not a new thing that younger audiences who are both getting older and getting younger are not on legacy platforms, and that we are having, to the previous question, to be on increasingly diverse sets of
I think in
networks,
the case
right?
of public service media in particular, the biggest thing is, first and foremost, especially in a world awash with absolutists and misinformation, that if public service media abandons social video, they are ceding those platforms to the bad actors. So even if you're not getting all the data you like, even if you're not getting 100% attribution, 50% attribution is better than 0% attribution. And the key here is, as a public service broadcaster or media whose literally the first 2 names in your category are public service, providing accurate and authentic, true news and information on those platforms, to me, there's no other more important role that you play.
I can see the question, and I agree with you again. But I think that maybe one of the more interesting things that we could be talking about, and I wish we had more time to talk about it on this panel, around using data to make better media, is about using data to do better fact-checking.
Yeah.
Is about using data to allow for more participatory relationships between audiences and journalists in a way that isn't overwhelming for journalists and that can enable there to be a greater diversity of voices. There's a whole other universe of ways that we need to be using data to inform our journalism, to support our journalists, and to do better quality public service media, there's a universe of really exciting opportunities out there to be doing that.
Yeah, now I agree with you.
Hooray!
But let's continue that conversation next year, right here. Last question, sir.
My question is, where do you think the guardrails are going to come to sort of identify the line between sort of helpful ad targeting and then outright manipulation? Because if we're talking about a world where data essentially might become interconnected between all these different sources, it's not a small leap to see a behavioral model that could actually predict what you might want but may not necessarily be good for you. So like, how is there going to be self-management within the industry to sort of draw those lines?
So I'm curious, when does it become too much, right? When does the data application become too much? because we had none of the available data in the 80s, and I'm pretty sure Philip Morris was one of the #1 advertisers in America, right? So like throwing that on data is the incorrect specter, right? What does data help us do that make more relevant advertising? It helps us produce more content at a lower price. People pay for media in a combination of two things, right? Now with streaming television, they actually pay for currency with subscriptions, but historically they've paid either through their cable bill, I guess is the corollary, and your attention to advertising, right? If you look at any of the actual earnings reports for any of us that have these different hybrid tiers, right? Paramount, we sell a no ads premium tier. I think it's $12 a month. And then there's like, for $7, you can have some ads. And then for free, we have Pluto, and there's a ton of ads, right? That's a direct demonstration of how this stuff works. And the reason those prices are what they are is because we're allowed to use data to monetize that kind of stuff. So I guess it all goes back to the question around, and this is what I think that it's really important when people start thinking about the data they're using and how they're collecting, and we think about the risk as a society, because I think that's kind of your question, from that data creation to realize, like, well, what are the motivations for the people that are actually doing such a thing? This is our conversation I think she was referencing. In the case of Paramount, our motivation is to create more episodes of Yellowstone, right? That is what we are judged on. You can read our earnings statements, and we'll be very clear about that. When does it get abusive? When folks that don't have clear motivations start to get involved and to use this data in ways that you don't really know, then I think there's a risk, and we have to look into that, right? But I do believe, especially a lot of the data and a lot of the privacy conversations that we have today are a bit misguided, especially as it pertains to media and to advertising. Because we're looking at rules, again, that exist in these frameworks that were written way before these platforms and products even existed, and they're designed to prevent outcomes that may not even be to the actual desire or what we're trying to accomplish. So now all we've done is managed to make it more difficult to make advertising work well, and now Evan has to sit through an unbelievable carousel of Warby Parker commercials.
Yeah, I would second the point that I don't think there's a relationship between the manipulativeness of advertising and data. Like if you look at the macro trends over the last few decades, I would argue advertising has become increasingly more truthful, or at least less egregiously manipulative. Everything from Geritol curing tired blood, to cigarettes, to Coke having cocaine in it, to being a pick-me-up, like all of that stuff was in the past, and it's increasingly becoming more accurate. I think in general what's happening is data is helping the advertising become more useful. But it's always going to be a persuasion medium, right?
Yeah, like, look, I actually disagree. I think advertising is more manipulative now than it ever has been, because that's sort of the point of it, right? Like,
It's supposed to change your behavior.
it's
the whole
literally
point.
supposed to change your behavior to buy a specific product. When there was cocaine in Coca-Cola, you didn't need to manipulate people. You just put cocaine in stuff,
That's how I do it.
right? Nowadays, though, when you see a small child put his hand up, dressed like Darth Vader, and his dad clicks the Volkswagen button, and that car fires to life, and we all have that moment. I'm a parent of 2 children, and you know that moment when you see that, and you're like, Jesus Christ, Volkswagens are awesome. That's manipulation.
We have to end there. We are out of time. We will continue this very conversation next year here. Thank you all for coming. This is a great panel. Thank you, panelists. Welcome to, I want to thank our 2 sponsors, Amagi, who is a great partner and really revolutionizing video around the world. I really want to thank VideoAmp for making this panel in particular possible. We could not have done it without them. Thank you all for spending the day with us. We really appreciate it. Have a good South by.